The Secret Science at Work by Max Freedom Long. Chapter 20. New Light on the Teachings of Jesus. In the foregoing chapters, we have seen that the Hunas, including Jesus, the greatest of them all, divided people roughly into two classes insofar as their normal relationship with the High Self Father was concerned. First, there was the class of persons who lived the kindly life and who were naturally inclined to be helpful and constructive. What few complexes they might have were of such a nature that they did not cause a feeling of guilt in the low self, which made it hide its face from the high self. The second class covered those who lived the predatory and hurtful to others' life. To a certain extent, or at worst, were entirely bent on following evil ways of life. They were the ones whose low selves were complexed with hates and fears and guilts, and who would not try to approach the high self in prayer because of these blockings of the Aka cord path. For the first class, the normally good and kindly people, there was in the teachings of Jesus a simple set of instructions to help them live the normal life in which all three of the selves work freely and successfully together. These were the outer teachings. They can be summed up in a few words. Jesus taught, number one, that we must love the Lord, or High Self Father. Number two, one must love his neighbors. This last part of the commandment is inclusive of all kindliness and excludes all hates and deeds and hurtfulness. But in his parable of the lost sheep, Jesus made it clear that his mission was primarily aimed at helping those who were cut off from the high self, teaching them how to unblock their paths and restore contact. He said in Matthew 18:11, "For the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost." Those lost sheep who suffered from the sins of evil deeds and who were cut off from their high selves by complexes or through the association with evil eating companions were his chief concern. As these individuals so seldom are able to help themselves to return to the fold of normal living, he placed the utmost stress on the need to carry the good word to them, to convert them, and to help them to live the good life. It is to be supposed that the cult of secrecy, which was all-powerful in the inner teachings through all ages, was necessary for reasons not clear to us today. In any case, the evidence that such a cult of secrecy was observed by the Hunas of the Old Testament as well as the New Testament is conclusive. We have seen how the knowledge was guarded by the Hunas of Polynesia in modern times. Now that we have the key to the secrets of the kingdom of heaven mentioned by Jesus, we find that it unlocks the inner truths concealed in many passages in which the inner teachings were touched upon by those who wrote the accounts of the life of Jesus after his death. In the Old Testament, we find repeated passages, in brackets, which could have been written only by men initiated into the secret lore, close bracket, which show through their use of symbols and code keys common to Huna, nothing more than that there are several forms of sin which can cause the blocking of the Aka cord to the high self. There are repeated promises that these blockings can and will be removed, provided proper steps are taken. But there is very little to tell what those steps were, or how they were to be understood and put to use. On the other hand, Jesus instituted a sweeping reform movement intended to break down old and useless beliefs in the Jewish religion and to make known the means of gaining release from hindering stumbling blocks which prevented men from contacting their high selves. It is to be seen that the disciples were initiated into the Huna lore and were instructed by use of the sacred language of the kahunas. Because of this knowledge of the sacred language, with its symbols and codes, the disciples, after the crucifixion, set about preserving and writing the directions for removing fixations and becoming freed from the clutches of eating companion spirits. The 4 Gospels contain all the veiled knowledge which we recognize as Huna. Jesus, with his extraordinary intelligence and insight, was able to condense his main teachings into 3 such dramatic units of presentation that, for the sake of the dramas alone, they would survive with little change. Straight teachings, as we have seen, become dogmatized and misunderstood very rapidly. But in a drama, while there may be dogmas invented to explain their inner meaning, the story told suffers little change. The story told suffers little change, and thus can carry down to following ages the means of understanding basic hidden truths. Although there is a wealth of Huna hidden in other dramas in the New Testament, the 3 which will be discussed in the following chapters are: number 1, the drama of baptism, in which was established the baptismal rite following the Great Temptation. Number 2, the drama of the Last Supper, in which was established the foot washing rite and the communion rite. Number 3, the drama of the crucifixion. One of the significant things about the 3 dramas which have been selected for our discussion is the fact that each one was played out as an actual part of the life of Jesus and his disciples. For this reason, the word drama is none too good for our use. The real-life incidents and happenings had, it is true, all the elements of drama in the truest sense, but lacked the make-believe which we have come in later centuries to associate with theatrical production. The mystery plays of early ages may have been patterned after the life incidents and put to use in initiatory rites, but never, so far as now known, has there been a perfection of dramatization against a background of reality and history such as was attained by Jesus. Let me read the sentence again. The mystery plays of the early ages may have been patterned after the life incidents and put to use in initiatory rites, but never, so far as is known, has there been a perfection of dramatization against a background of reality and history such as was attained by Jesus. The greatest of the 3 dramas was embodied in the most startling dramatization on record, that of the crucifixion. In playing out his part in this, Jesus lost his life, but left an incident so dramatic and impressive and poignant that every detail of it has been remembered for almost 2,000 years. It was recorded by his well-initiated disciples so carefully that at any future time, one understanding the ancient lore might find in the events the keys to the oldest and most perfect philosophy ever evolved by mankind. Looking back from our vantage point as seekers of the ancient knowledge, we can see how necessary it was to make sure that the information embodied in the dramatic events should not be lost with the passage of time. It is apparent from the words of Jesus that he intended the disciples to initiate others into the secret lore, and that there should be continuous initiations from generation to generation. It is also evident that he hoped for a growth in numbers of the initiates and a spreading of the knowledge far and wide. But also, knowing human nature and the limitations of human intellect, he took the steps necessary to prevent the complete loss of the knowledge in case the disciples failed and the chain initiates were hindered or contaminated. Indeed, he no doubt foresaw the future in this case as in so many others. Before his time, many of the kahunas in the Mediterranean basin country had set off towards the islands of the Pacific, apparently to find a place where outside influences would be cut off and their treasured secret knowledge could survive secure and uncontaminated. That it did so until the turn of the last century should enable men of this new age to use the recovered knowledge to learn again, through the use of symbols and code, the knowledge which Jesus built into the dramatic incidents surrounding the presentation of his most priceless teachings. And we are fortunate that the accounts given in the four Gospels by the disciples were so simply written that even the translation into other languages and the accidents of much copying failed to bring about basic changes. The pearls of great price were so carefully concealed that only the initiates knew that they were there, and no outsider was able to find and destroy them. In our discussion of the dramatic events, only the events in the life of Jesus and his immediate disciples can be trusted. The failure to find others who could and would accept the authentic initiations seems to have been surprisingly swift, while the growth of misunderstanding and of dogmatic and groundless assertions and teachings began almost immediately. Paul, who never knew Jesus, was one of the disruptive influences. The dogma superimposed by him upon the original teachings are still part and parcel of organized Christianity. It is clear to the student that Paul was not an initiate kahuna. Not only was he unacquainted with Jesus, he hardly knew the disciples. After the crucifixion and his conversion on the road of Damascus, after the crucifixion and his conversion on the road to Damascus, he went to Arabia for a period of 3 years. Only after that did he go to Jerusalem, where he stayed with Peter 15 days. And then in brackets it says, Galatians, Galatians, 1:17-18. In Arabia, he presumably invented his system of beliefs. These beliefs used Jesus as the cornerstone, but the main structure was Judaism, pure and simple, brought up from the past. Then in brackets it says here, Paul was a Jew, a Pharisee, close brackets. Jesus had offered reforms in the rites and beliefs of the Jews. He had, from the time of baptism by John, rejected the use of sprinkled sacrificial blood as an instrument of actual forgiveness of sin, to say nothing of the symbol of such forgiveness. But not so Paul. Lacking the initiation and the secrets that lay behind the 3 basic rites instituted by Jesus, he went back to the early rites of the Jews to find justification for his dogmatic statements covering the real meaning of the life and the teachings of Jesus. In his letter to the Romans, Paul elaborated his dogmas and doctrines in a most revealing manner. He declared that because Adam had sinned, his sins were shared by all his children, all mankind. The death of Jesus was necessary and right, he said, because it brought about forgiveness or justification by his blood for all who would perform the simple mental feat of accepting this dogma and believing that in this manner Jesus had made atonement for all the sins of the world, had paid to the uttermost, and had redeemed the world. True, Paul taught that all should live the good and kindly life. That was the outer doctrine, but he was unable to see the significance in the foot-washing rite, or the rite of communion. He entirely misunderstood the inner significance of the death upon the cross, and could find in it nothing beyond a duplication of the savage blood sacrifice rites of purification which had been outgrown with the slow march of civilization, and which Jesus himself strove to reform. He made no effort to help institute a reform in the old rites, but stumbled about trying to make them fit into the new system which he was evolving. Where Jesus had restated the meaning behind the covenant between God and the Jews, Paul declared that the old covenant obtained by Moses had decayed and was for that reason no longer in force. In brackets, Hebrews 9:12. He went further, changing the original concept of the contract between God and the Israelites to the idea of a will or a last will and testament. This being something left behind by Jesus as his legacy to humanity. This legacy to save the world, it was represented, was earned by the shedding of his blood to appease a God of vengeance who held humanity in ransom for the sins of Adam, not the God described by Jesus as the loving Father. Paul argued that God never forgave sins except in return for a blood sacrifice. Therefore, it was necessary that the actual blood of Jesus be shed in the same exact and literal sense as the blood of animals in the Mosaic times. In Hebrews, verse 22, we read this argument, quote, "And almost all things are by law purged with blood, and without shedding of blood is no remission," end quote. Jesus is then described as a high priest, not entering the holy place once a year with the blood of animals as a sacrifice, but with his own blood, open quote. "Now, once in the end of the world, he hath appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself," end quote. In verse 16, he explained, "For where a testament is, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator." Paul was a great student of scriptural writings, using them constantly in trying to prove his doctrines. Therefore, he must have been thoroughly familiar with Jeremiah's prophecy of a new covenant, which has come for the people. Jesus had the sacred writings at instant command in arguing with the temple hierarchy and was well aware of the prophecy in question. Therefore, when he said in the communion rite, "This is my blood of the new covenant," he means that which Jeremiah prophesied, as we shall see presently. And open brackets. I am aware that the King James Version has it, "This is my blood of the New Testament." Undoubtedly, a confusion on the part of the translators, because they were working on the Pauline documents too. End bracket. Jesus had never spoken of leaving a legacy, but Paul, in working up his doctrine, became so convinced of his will and testament idea that he ignored the use of the word covenant, so all important in the earlier writings. Let us now see what Jeremiah prophesied. Jeremiah 31:31. And then there's a long quote here. "Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they break, although I was an husband to them, saith the Lord. But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, saith the Lord, I will put my law in their inward parts, and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people." End quote. These are the words of a kahuna. The words I have italicized. That means the above quote, that lengthy quote that I just read, that was all in italics, okay? So it says, the words I have italicized show that God's law will be enshrined in man's consciousness. Yes, even in his subconscious, in brackets, heart. It will no longer be necessary in that time to come that men shall be led by the hand. This is God's part of the covenant. Now as to the people's part, and here's another quote, it's just a paragraph long, and it's all in italics as well. "And they shall teach no more every man his neighbor, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them unto the greatest of them, saith the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more." End quote. There we have the picture of each and every man having the knowledge and the power ultimately to make contact with his high self. Was not that the goal that Jesus, in all his teaching, was preparing man for? We note that the prophecy makes no mention of the shedding of blood to gain the salvation, which Paul asserted could be gained in no other way, and which he further asserted demanded the blood of Jesus. This was a, quote, new covenant, end quote. Isaiah 53:3 furnishes one of the most famous of the prophecies quoted to show that Jesus was the Redeemer. Here again, mention is made of a covenant, which is here in the making, and of the redemption from sin, but no word is said to support the Pauline doctrine of blood sacrifice, which has superseded the true Huna teaching of the way and the means of redemption, or escaping from the stumbling blocks of sin. Isaiah prophesied thus. And here's a long quote, all in italics. This is Isaiah's prophecy. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrow and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. By his knowledge shall my righteous servant justify many, for he will bear their iniquities. And the Redeemer shall come to Zion, and unto him that turn from transgression in Jacob with the Lord. As for me, this is my covenant with them, my spirit that is upon thee, and my words which I have put in thy mouth shall not depart out of thy mouth, nor out of the mouth of any of thy seed. End quote. The teachings of Jesus were such that at no time did he advocate the morning and evening blood sacrifices of the early Jews, or the sacrifice by priests for the remission of their sins of the tribe as a whole. He advocated no man heaping of sins on a scapegoat. In his teachings, the remission was a personal matter which every man had to take care of for himself, or with the aid of a friend if necessary. There was no mass remission, no blood sacrifice at all. The one occasion upon which he spoke approvingly of a blood sacrifice was that of the initiation of the communion rite. And as we shall see when we take up that rite for discussion, it was not actual shedding of his own blood that he meant, but behind his words and behind the Huna symbol of blood lies something of an entirely different nature. It is imperative, if we are to get a true insight into the teachings of Jesus, that the baseless dogmas of Paul be understood for what they are, meaningless things which have little or nothing to do with the inner teachings of Jesus. But it is not exactly fair to blame Paul too harshly for what he did. After all, he was not an initiate. He did not have the eyes to see and the ears to hear. He was a zealot, like many others since his time, and not finding any dogma in the teachings of Jesus, he felt impelled to inject it into the new church being founded. He was a very complex character, suffering some kind of physical ailment of which he complained in his letters, and which he seemed unable to cure. To Paul, we owe some of the most beautiful of biblical literature. He was intolerant and bigoted on some subjects, for example, the place of women in the church, and yet he was capable of an inspired passage like the 13th chapter of the Corinthians. Quote, "Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, and have not charity," end quote, etc. That, of course, was one of the outer teachings of Jesus. The pity of it all is that the early church and men down through the centuries since have followed the Pauline dogmas as if they were truly a part of what Jesus taught of what Jesus taught. We need to see, as one example among many, that the crystallization of the Pauline errors were responsible for the crude concepts which later appeared in the Church as the Mass, in which the communicant is taught to believe in a transmutation of the wine and the wafer, so that he actually drinks the blood and eats the flesh of a sacrifice, third part of God. Dogmas, when not founded on fact, have a way of demanding the invention of other dogmas to support them. Christianity lost the true inner meanings of the teachings under a deep layer of misunderstanding, which I believe the rediscovery of Huna can clear away and replace with the original system of knowledge. And that concludes chapter 20. Chapter 21 is entitled The Secret Meaning Behind the Baptismal Rite. And I would appreciate if you have any thoughts or comments on this last chapter that I read, if you put them in the comments below. I myself am not very religious. I am more spiritual, and hence probably some of the meaning of that last chapter that I read has been lost on me. I will read it again and try to understand it, and try to especially, I think, understand it in light of the political situation right now in Israel and Gaza. Maybe this chapter sheds a light on that. If you have any thoughts on that, let me know. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Till soon.